leading off the conference, we've got Eric Fraiulu, who's going to give you a glimpse into where this is all going and how we're going to be a part of it.
Thanks. All right. Today I wanted to talk about YUI and the future here. So I think it's good to start with sort of an introspective question to ask, like, what is YUI? And really, like, people start shouting things out. Wake up, drink coffee. Let me know. What do you guys think? What is YUI? Japanese music star. That is true. Like, what do you think? Is framework, library? Come on, let's hear some ideas here. Awesome. Loader, okay.
Well done.
Modules. So, widgets, components, platform. And so I've been thinking about this a lot, and we've been talking about it. And really, what it seems to boil down to is it's not those things, but really a set of design principles. And really, what you're seeing is the code that we have, the widgets we have, the components we have, is really just these design principles that YUI has being applied. And here, some of them. We just had everybody come up here who's been a part of the project for a long time. And if you look, these principles are what has guided the project and has led it to where it is today. And if we take a look at, like, okay, we have these principles, but how are they actually applied? I want to look at the web platform here. So this is like the technology stack that we're working with in the browser. And this is trying to show it over time. It's clearly growing in size. And if we zoom in here to the past, so if we start with the past, what were we dealing with? Well, first, it was just these desktop browsers. There were a few of them. We were working in JavaScript. A specification was created and formalized into ES3. We were working with basic HTML and CSS. And at the time, these things were becoming standards. There was the W3C. There was ECMAScript working to, or the ECMA organization working to standardize these technologies. So there were some differences. IE did things different than Firefox, and then Chrome came around. And we were using libraries and frameworks like YUI, YUI2, and even YUI3 to help sort of fill this gap or deal with these inconsistencies and really build on this platform. But then as we move to what we're dealing with today, it looks slightly different, and there's kind of a lot more stuff. And if you notice the staircasing happening here, so one of the most major changes has been mobile devices, new forms of input, new constraints around screen size, and also around network latency. And it's just, and that also has pushed us where now we have like HTML5 and CSS3 features. Mobile was one of the driving forces for this, like geolocation APIs and this sort of thing that we never really thought about before when we were just dealing with desktop browsers. And then we also have ES5, so JavaScript is advancing. There really isn't much new stuff in ES5. I mean, there is, but it hasn't really changed the way that we use JavaScript. There are some new things like we can do with objects, like defining properties and that sort of thing, but nothing really big changing there. But HTML5 and CSS, there has been a lot of like major changes and changing the way that we think about the web platform and the types of things we can do and the types of interfaces we can build. But when we look to the future here, this pace of adding layers is not slowing down. One of the primary things with the web and what these browser vendors are doing and what these standards are making sure is that they're never breaking old code. So old code will always be able to run in the new browsers. So we're adding layers. And what we see here is the layers added was ES6, which is the next specification for the specification for the next version of JavaScript. And then also I added web components up here. And I wanted to take a look at these two a little bit more in depth because I think that they're pretty substantial. So if we look at JavaScript in ES6, what is ES6? And here are some things that are in ES6. I tried to highlight in sort of bold here the primary ones, I think. are going to be most important. But really what we're seeing is that there's these this is a massive fundamental change to JavaScript. These are it's going from just having your little toolbox to now having power tools in your shed. And this is just going to fundamentally change the way that we're solving problems with this language. And this is a big deal. And I think that one of the biggest things here is modules. So we don't really have great code organization mechanisms in JavaScript right now. We do an object pattern or module pattern or namespacing things, trying to reduce globals. But we don't really have a standardized module system. We don't have a way to organize our code in a standard way that works in all these environments, works on mobile, works on desktop, works across frameworks, works on the server in Node. And ES6 modules is an attempt to really do this and do this well. Luckily, some of us on the YUI team at Yahoo here are able to be participating in TC39, which is the group defining ECMAScript 6. And we've been able to take all the knowledge that we have with YUI and the module system developed over 5 years ago and help make sure that we're shaping this conversation, making sure that modules is going to fit the types of things that we know that we need it to do based on all of our experience using a JavaScript module system for so many years in YUI. And this is going to be great, to have something where AMD modules and YUI modules and Node.js modules can all play nicely together. It's going to be great. And then if we look at what's going on in the HTML and CSS land, we see web components is actually a collection of new specifications here. So there's templates, and templates are what you expect, but they're actually just written in HTML. So it's basically an inert set of HTML that isn't applied that you can reuse over and over again. And we do this now with in our frameworks and in our applications as we create templates and we reuse them. There's also decorators. This is to be able to add style and behavior, but this is where we can control things. We can say, you know what, I don't want these parent styles to affect my widget from the rest of the page. It gives us this nice control over the encapsulation. And this is what we try to do with YUI and the widget framework that we have. And we actually even have a contextual CSS reset module to try to reset all the CSS for a particular component so that we can build it up the way we want to and have control over that. And then also custom elements, which is to be able to provide new HTML elements. But then what's really awesome is those are also reflected in the JavaScript space. And you have a constructor and you have an ability to hook into the HTML system and be able to control the behavior of these elements. And this should sound a lot like YUI's widget system or other widget or component systems you've used. And that's because these specifications are being driven by what we're doing at the framework level, what we're doing in our applications. And then the other ones here as part of the web components collection is the shadow DOM. And that's this idea of basically encapsulating these components and allowing them to live on their own and not necessarily be in the page, or you can put them in the page when you want to, but really encapsulation. And then imports, which is, okay, now we are defining our web component with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. How do we load this stuff into the browser? And that's what the import specification is trying to work on. So we have, I think these are two big fundamental shifts coming with ES6, web components. Even parts of ES6 right now are shipping in Chrome and Firefox. So if you go look in your console, you can see this. You can run Node.js with the Harmony flag turned on. I believe that's what it is. And these features these new APIs and stuff will be available. So this stuff is coming, and it's coming fast. And there's also this other shift, which is I put up here the mobile and desktop browsers, but the thing is these browsers are turning into this idea of an evergreen browser. You install it once on your computer, and it's constantly updating with new features from the web platform. So as these specifications are happening and the specifications and the implementations are now happening at the same time, and then browsers are just constantly putting this new stuff in all the time. And this is a big change. We're used to browsers before in the past being on these very long release cycles. And even the ones that aren't like Firefox or Chrome doing this auto-updating thing, that are like Safari or IE, these browsers are also, Microsoft and Apple are also moving to more rapid release cycles for their operating system. So we're seeing yearly release cycles of OS X and iOS, and we're also seeing more rapid release cycles of Windows. I'm not sure exactly what their schedule is, but it's definitely faster than it used to be. And we're seeing IE 10 and 11 coming out in quick succession. So that's the thing here. It's like we shouldn't think of ES6 and web components as these like big fundamental shifts that are just anomalies. Like, oh, okay, this is kind of the first time we're going to see these big shifts in the web platform, because the way that all this stuff is working, it's just going to pick up pace, and this stuff's just going to come in the browsers because of the model that they're moving to, which is this auto-updating model. So I think this is like that's the biggest change for me, is this realization that these things aren't like anything special. We have to really rethink when we're looking at, this web platform as a whole and seeing this progress that it has, that how are we going to deal with this? Like, we're trying to write our application code on top of all this, and it's just going to keep going up. How do we do that? And I think that's where you see YUI or any collection of frameworks, libraries, polyfills, whatever, really trying to help fill in these gaps. And I think the main thing here is it's trying to smooth out this curve, because we want to be able to write our applications that are long-lived, living longer than features of the web platform even, like new features coming in. So it's like the role of frameworks like YUI or any JavaScript libraries or polyfills, or just like the ecosystem we have in the user-land JavaScript code, is to try to help smooth out this curve for application developers, but then to also be figuring out what's going to be next. What are the next patterns that will eventually become standards in the web platform? And I think that this really depicts it well, to show this sort of easing out of the curve, but then also that we are going to have a new set of challenges and new things that we're trying to build on top of these systems and do more complex stuff. So when thinking about this, like, okay, where does YUI fit in here? And thinking back at, these core design principles, I think this is like an interesting time for us to be able to figure out, like, which of these principles still apply, like reevaluating them, and then also how do they apply to this new world, this like ever-changing web platform. And I think that this is great. And what's awesome is to see a lot of these things actually being completely still valid. Some of them I think we want to test. And I think there will be new design principles that we add to this list. One of the ones that I think is really interesting that YUI has done is this concept of facades. That I think one of the best ways to think of this is that we have a y.array.each method, but ES5 added for each on arrays. So it's kind of this wrapping API approach. And it's really contrasted with polyfills, so something that's trying to like fill in the gaps on the older browsers with what has been standardized in the platform. And I think we've shied away from this polyfill approach in the past because of things like prototype or just things doing it wrong and doing it bad. But the level that people are working at in the greater JavaScript community is a much higher one. People are writing tests. Their specifications are being written so that they can actually be polyfilled with JavaScript code without needing fancy host objects that only browsers can do. And so it's really great that the people working on these standards are conscious of this and making sure that we can fill in these gaps. And I think as a overall community, like even outside of the YUI community, we can collaborate together on creating the best of class polyfills. And then I think this becomes a more palatable solution for some of these problems that we try to deal with here. And one thing is it increases interoperability. So if in my code I have y.array.each, now all of a sudden I have this big dependency on YUI. Even if you were to use something like underscore or Lodash, it's kind of a big library if you're just using like each to make sure it works in ES3 and ES5 browsers. And you see this even like with what has recently happened with Lodash is like, okay, we're going to make every single function its own NPM module, and now there's like 200 NPM modules. It's kind of crazy, but like that's where something like a polyfill approach could maybe deal with some of these problems better. Another point on interoperability is getting back to this idea of modules in a single JavaScript module system to rule them all. And this is where I think it's really interesting what we could do with YUI and ES6 modules. So if YUI were to embrace ES6 modules, I think this would open up so many possibilities for us. And this is something that we've been actively thinking about. It's on like our goals as Yahoo employees to be trying to work on this stuff and come up with something great. And just sort of the background here. So ES6 modules are defining a new syntax for being able to declaratively import things from other modules and have explicit exports. So there's one problem with new syntax is that it's not going to run in old browsers. So while the mode that these people who are defining the standards are in, these standards bodies are in, is that all the stuff, anytime a new browser comes out or new specifications are added, old code and old websites will still be able to run. But the reverse isn't true. You can't just load new syntax and new features into old browsers and expect it to work. It just won't. So there's this step here, which is to transpile. So what we're thinking is authoring in ES6 modules and using tooling to transpile these modules into the module systems that can run everywhere today. And so Node.js, YUI, AMD. And there's already projects going on. Actually, Square, the credit card processing company, they actually have an open source project on GitHub that does this transpilation. And if we can bake this into the tool chain that we have, we're already building code. We're using YUI. We're already like building our modules, minifying the code. So this is just like another step in the build process here. And it will also make authoring modules so much better. For writing ES6 modules, we can even have way better tooling around statically verifying whether or not you're importing all the proper modules that are providing all the exports that you're trying to use. So we would have this like development time static analysis as being possible with ES6 modules as well. And one like primary problem that we have with this approach with YUI is this idea of explicit exports versus namespacing. So in YUI, we have y.foo equals foo, some constructor or something. But like in AMD or in ES6 modules, you do an explicit export. So the problem is we don't know when we pass a Y object into a module body what it did to that Y object. It could have put stuff all over the place. And we would have to do like a whole bunch of dirty checking of the object to figure out what the diff is essentially between it. And that's just gross. But we think that we have some ideas on a solution for this that we would be able to do to the YUI core modules that would essentially replace this idea of namespacing with an export method. And what that would do is give us a hook to know, okay, this module, and do bookkeeping on saying like, okay, this module is adding this thing at this namespace. And we would be able to deal with essentially this idea of backwards compatibility. Because if we come up with like a new module system, what we would want is we would want YUI to depend on that new module system, but then we also want to be able to load all old YUI 3 code in that environment. We'd want to be able to load AMD modules in that environment. We want to be able to load Node.js modules in that environment. And this is where I really think we can pull this off. We can work even as a greater JavaScript community to create a new ES module system. And I think this is going to be like a huge change and really great for us and be able to have the types of backwards compatibility that we know that we need to do, but then be future looking and forward looking and people writing their application code in ES6 modules, and it'll be amazing. It'll be great. And one major thing it'll do is kill these walled gardens. This is like, we want to put everything into YUI because YUI defines our code organization mechanism right now, which is YUI modules. That's how we think of it. We want to think in that way. And without having a universal module system, we're just like, okay, yeah, there's this, I want to use Moment.js. It's an AMD module. Like, what do I do? Do I wrap it in YUI? Okay, yeah, I'll figure out a way to like add the YUI wrapper around it. And that's kind of hard, like it's tricky. Or what we'll do is like, oh, that's just a really small component. Let's rewrite it completely in YUI and it's really because of this fundamental thing of these systems, these module systems or code organization mechanisms not being compatible. So I think we can really like knock down these walled gardens that we have with AMD, with Node, with YUI, and really have this more interoperable system between these different runtime platforms. And Jenny was talking about this today. What we're also realizing is like these front-end problems that we're trying to solve are getting bigger, more complex, and basically being like client and server systems. So we're currently working on some stuff around revamping internationalization. This is another thing where there's been a specification now as part of ECMAScript 5.1, sort of an amended specification. And that's something that there's like a polyfill for that passes the test that the actual spec defines. So this is like thinking of it that way, but some parts of that are just not possible or not practical to really be in the browser, and including like loading all the assets for the resource files for like localization. And this is where we're really seeing like this problem spanning client and server, and there's jobs to be done by the server that are much better to be done there than to just try to do everything in the client. And we're also seeing this with like performance and being able to render initial page loads on the server and then passing off control to the client. So we're really seeing this like client-server system, and this is something like Node.js has really allowed us to explore, and it's gained control of sort of the front-end side of the server space. Actually, Clarence, I believe right after this talk, is going to be talking about in more detail what we're actually thinking here and what we're actually doing. And in terms of how this maps to the YUI project, like the projects we're working on around YUI and even beyond that, are YUI Pure and Modown. So like YUI and Pure on the client side. So this is one thing we've also done is we've extracted the CSS that was locked into YUI and made a new project, Pure CSS. And it's really started with what we had in YUI at its core, but then expanded to include providing styles for the most common web components that all websites and applications have, but then also looking towards responsive design and tooling and other things that we want to do, and integrating with other code bases, being available over Bower, and really, playing nice in the just greater open source and development communities. And then we're also doing a lot of interesting stuff with YUI and making sure to work across all the different devices, mobile and desktop. Thilo is going to be talking about the gesture support that he's been revamping there. But then also for the server side of things, we've been looking at, okay, how do we sort of take the same approach we did with Pure, but doing it on the server, and really adding some Node.js packages that extend the functionality that is available on something like Express, which is a very popular web application framework. How do we extend that, but have a set of components that you use how you need them, and not dictate everything about how your application should run, but really to help fulfill the server side of these client-server systems and deal with these harder, complex front-end problems that we're dealing with. So yeah, what I encourage everyone to do is enjoy the talks throughout this conference, but really be thinking about what really is coming down the pike in the web platform, and you just have that in the back of your mind while you're listening to the other talks and discussions, because I think that this is this is not going away. The future, there's always going to be a future. It's always going to be bigger, and it's always going to be coming faster. Thanks. So I don't know if do we have time for questions? Okay. So if anybody has questions for me? Yeah.
What are your
Wait for the mic.
timeline thoughts, if any?
Could you please wait for the mic?
About the module? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, this makes, I think, perfect sense for many of us, and I've been wanting to see something about when are you gonna, kind of transition or merge and work or play nicely with like AMD, which is, everybody uses that. And so, but any thoughts on, are you gonna start that anytime soon? Are we looking like 1 year, or are we looking like 6 months? Or
So there's one fundamental piece in this timeline, which is, and there's a lot of work happening right now to try to finish this in time, which is to get the spec for modules to land in ES6. The timeline right now for when the feature set of ES6 is supposed to be locked down is the end of this year, with essentially a review process for the following year. But that doesn't mean that implementations can't try to implement the spec then, and they probably will start. And then there will be problems figured out which will feed back into the TC39 process to try to resolve those by the time the spec is final, which so we're the first piece in the timeline is waiting and trying to help make sure that we can get this into the spec by the end of the year. And then what we're looking at is in Q1 to really figure out how all these pieces come together. Like, how do we do this stuff with tooling, with loading, with polyfilling old browsers, and then being able to build on top of there with the features that we know we want to do, which is like make sure we can handle loading in AMD and legacy YUI modules, and also do combo loading and this sort of stuff. So it's something that we're going to be basically starting helping with getting the spec finalized, but then also in Q1 working on the user land side of this. Anyone else?
Hello. Hey, Dave. Good morning.
Good morning.
What is the future of YY when we start to talk about frameworks? Like in the industry right now, we have a lot of single application frameworks like Ember.js, Angular, Knockout, and we cannot use YY with these frameworks because of the layer of integration. And what is your vision about that, and how we can start to work with the community outside Yahoo to bring this new technology and have a better time to market using new technologies and new libraries, new frameworks, and what is your vision?
Well, so I think that having a module system that can work with the existing module systems out there, other libraries and frameworks, like you're saying, Ember, making Ember and YUI, making it easy to use Ember and YUI together, is definitely something that a common ES module system would help facilitate. There would obviously be like duplication of code with the fact that like if you're using YUI widgets in your Ember application, Ember is going to be loading in jQuery, and we're going to have YUI's DOM and Node stuff. But I think that that's kind of just going to be an interim thing where we deal with this code duplication once we have this better way to organize our code through a better module system, and like maybe having things like NPM and Bower including all of the front end code that we're working with, and really be able to see where the sweet spot is, like in terms of what code you would be wanting to use out of YUI, and what stuff inside of YUI would be dependent on other things, like if we want to depend on Lodash or something like this, or polyfills to help fill in things. And then I think you'll start to see these frameworks and libraries using more common parts, being built up of more common parts. So if that answers that.
About web components, are you thinking about using some existing polyfill like Polymer from Google or Xtags from Mozilla? Or do you think you're going to wait until web components be working everywhere and then implemented?
So that's a great question. I'm not sure yet what the best approach is, because then if you look at, I think a third option would be so the polyfills like Polymer and stuff are trying to do a lot of crazy things to make web components work today. And I think we would have to evaluate whether those trade-offs are really worth it. Or if what we would want to do is set up things inside of the way that YUI works that sort of like gives a nod towards web components, where you're organizing your code in that fashion, but you're maybe not getting like all of the features, you're not getting true web components, but at least you're thinking in that mindset, and we're like gearing you up towards when that's available ubiquitously in the platform, it's not like a big shift for you because you're already using this and really just parts of the framework, you're not using anymore or something like that. But yeah, that's something that I think that we should evaluate and figure out, and I think that sort of the greater community of web developers is trying to think about that right now, like what to do in terms of using Polymer or X tags, or taking an approach where you're just more using today's technologies, but using those same principles in the way that you organize your components and compose them.
I think it's the latest version of Prototype has dropped older IE support so they can move forward with some of the newer technologies. The backward compatibility of YUI is great, and I love it. But at some point, the tail becomes too long and become too entrenched without moving forward. Is there any consideration of dropping some of the support for the older versions, particularly when you're talking about IE6? Hey, IE6, ECMAScript 6 would be great. What about ECMAScript 5? Would even be great also. Mm-hmm. Is there any considerations to setting a point release to YUI 4, YUI 3X that, hey, going forward, it's only going to support Y, so it can start taking advantage of so many of these new features that have come up over the last 7-8 years?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One lucky thing that we have in YUI is just the very modular approach that was taken when developing the core, so that you're not necessarily getting the baggage that's needed to support older IE versions when you're running in the latest version. And so that's definitely allowing us to like hold over much longer than I think a lot of other libraries or frameworks. But I think one of the key issues we're seeing is that the types of applications we want to build are much more resource intensive and require like very like fast performance. And the problem is like the JavaScript engines that are in the modern browsers are 2, maybe 3 orders of magnitude faster than the old ones. And I think that's going to be one of the major things that like walls that we will be hitting and kind of hit, where people are developing applications and they're using tons of like models and views and doing all this fancy stuff, and then you try to run it in older IEs and it's like GCing all the time, and that's where I wonder how the effort versus browser it's like another area where that plays out. But yeah, so I think it's also, we want to be data-driven by this, and we're working to try to make sure we have the best data and understand it, to understand like how people are using YUI off the CDN and this sort of thing. So, yeah.
Thank you.